Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean, historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. The Scoundrel's Bride by Emma Ashwood. Prologue. Jane Mellor did not see the magic of Christmas as so many children did. Not even the first flakes of snow fluttering over New York City, lending Central Park an almost otherworldly shimmer, inspired any excitement in Jane. The first Christmas she had spent with George had been magical. Just the two of them in their small apartment was all Jane could ever have wished for. She and George had spent hours talking about raising a family and the names they would give their future children. Jane had always had a particular affinity for the name Annie, if they had a daughter, or Jack for a son. In a perfect world, they would have at least 2 children. She had always thought that as a mother, she would make sure not to make the same mistakes as her parents. She would certainly avoid her father's idea of parenting. Jane had no siblings of her own, and had therefore always dreamt of raising a large family, a family in which there would be no shortage of love. It was a vow she had made herself long ago. For a while, it seemed as though she would be able to fulfill the vow with George, but then the trajectory changed abruptly. Not a single day went by without Jane thinking about George and the horrible fate that had befallen him. It had been an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, much like every Wednesday over the recent months, with Jane holding with a delicately ornate china cup and seated in Sarah Manning's living room. Jane inhaled the sweet aroma of cinnamon rose in the steam before she took a careful sip of the tea. These afternoon tea meetings with Sarah and their friends were a recent addition to Jane's routine, but one she had come to grow particularly fond of. Sarah was the first person to welcome Jane and George into their new neighborhood. She had a kind and sincere face, which filled Jane with a strange sense of familiarity. Not to mention, she was stunningly beautiful, with perfect doll-like golden locks and an immaculate sense of fashion. It wasn't long before Jane and Sarah became friends. If she was honest, though, Jane had a feeling that it was easy to be friends with Sarah, whether you wanted to or not. The other women in their group were also friendly, and Jane liked them well enough, but Sarah was her closest friend. It was a newspaper boy on the street who first told them what had happened. An explosion at a warehouse had killed several employees and destroyed almost the entire building. Somehow, even though the name of the warehouse had not been mentioned, Jane knew in her heart that it was George's place of work. When her suspicions were confirmed, Jane felt as though the very ground beneath her feet had opened and swallowed her. It seemed entirely unfair and cruel that something so awful should happen to her George. He had always been an extremely kind man who was loved by everyone who knew him. For days following the incident, Jane had been overcome by grief and disbelief. A part of her refused to believe that George was gone, and she sat on his chair in their living room, listening for his familiar footsteps upstairs. They never came. Everyone told her it would get easier with time, but Jane didn't believe them. Sure, she still went to afternoon tea with Sarah and the women, but this was more to alleviate Sarah's worries than for Jane's benefit. Thankfully, George left her the means to live comfortably for a while. Unfortunately, that money would run out eventually, and then what would she do? Jane possessed some sewing skills, so perhaps she might be able to find employment as a seamstress. The truth was, even if she got a job, the thought of having to live alone in the apartment that was home to her and George made her stomach churn. Dinkus Palatino screen. Impoing. That morning, the sun's golden rays pierced through the clouds which had been hovering ominously over New York for days on end. Usually, Jane kept her normal routine on Wednesdays. She rose early, had oatmeal for breakfast, and wrote in her journal. This morning, however, Jane decided that since the sun had blessed them with a rare appearance, she would venture outdoors for a walk. Central Park wasn't too far, and quite frankly, she could do with a change of scenery. Jane adored the hustle and bustle of life in a city. New York had so much to offer, and there was so much to do. No 2 days were the same, and there was always a chance of meeting new people with exciting stories to share. Sometimes, Jane wished that she was a little more outgoing because she would then perhaps have more chance to meet those people others so often talked about. As a child, she was often very quiet and preferred to play by herself rather than with other girls her age. At first, this worried her parents, but they quickly realized the truth, that Jane simply enjoyed her own company. After strolling along one of the park's many paths, Jane finally arrived at a small pond. It had frozen over weeks before when winter began to lay its mark of cold on the land. It wasn't yet frozen enough to skate on from one side to the other, but Jane guessed that within weeks, once the temperature dropped, families would be enjoying an afternoon of leisure here with their children. A cold breeze ruffled Jane's hair, and she tucked a strand of her golden locks behind her ear. A little snow fell from a tree above her head and created a layer of white dust on her mourning clothes. In 2 weeks, she would be free to hang her mourning clothes in the wardrobe after the year period had passed. These days, these rules weren't really necessary, but she had learnt these traditions from her own grandmother. She had been a formidable Englishwoman who had left London at 20 in the hope for a better life. Wearing mourning clothes was sometimes as heavy as the grief she still felt in her chest, but the day she took off the black dress that had almost become part of her identity, Jane made a promise to herself. Once she changed clothes, she would do everything in her power to make sure that George had not died in vain, and that she would try to be happy again. After all, Jane knew in her heart that George would want her to move on with her life, and not forever dwell on memories of him and hopes of what could have been. He would have wanted her to be strong. Jane could not help but feel a little frightened. Would she forget George if she removed her mourning clothes? Would he fade from her memory like a dream remembered only in the moments after waking? Jane did want her life back. She wanted to be happy again, and she wanted to accomplish all she knew George would have wanted for her. Sarah Manning had told her just the other day that she was still young and that there was still hope for her. "Why are you sad?" The voice caught Jane off guard. Not because her thoughts had been interrupted, but because of the person behind the voice. A little girl, no older than perhaps 8 or 9, stood in front of her wearing a pink dress embroidered with flowers. Her auburn hair had been turned into a long plait that hung over her right shoulder. Under her arm was a doll dressed very similarly, but boasting red hair rather than auburn. Her brown eyes seemed to almost glimmer in the sunlight, and Jane thought that the little girl's mother must surely be just as beautiful as she. Jane had never been afraid to talk with children and often found them to be more thoughtful and truthful than some adults. She had simply been caught unawares, lost as she had been in her own world, as was so often the case lately. Jane had always been a daydreamer, which often got her into trouble at school as a child, but she had never changed her ways, and for that she was glad. After all, one of the reasons George had fallen in love with her in the first place was because he thought Jane was very sure of herself and who she wanted to be, no matter what others thought. "What do you mean?" Jane asked in a friendly tone, feeling a little embarrassed that someone had noticed her mood. "I saw that you were crying," said the little girl. "Why would you cry when the day is so beautiful?" Jane pondered her answer for a few seconds. She was struck by the clear conviction of the little girl's question. It wasn't entirely suitable to divulge the truth behind her sadness to a small child, but what should she say? She didn't have the heart to lie to the girl because it was clear that she was astute and could read Jane's mood. However, Jane would not want the girl to tell her parents that she had met a sad and strange lady in the park. She could very well do without such a reputation. "My husband died a year ago," Jane explained. "It has been a year, but I still miss him every day. We often walked around Central Park, and I was just reminded of him." For a while, the little girl didn't reply, studying her instead, as if she was trying to process Jane's words. Jane hoped she hadn't upset her young companion with her honesty, but there was no reason to lie. "My daddy died when I was very little," the little girl admitted as she perched herself on the bench next to Jane. It made my mommy very sad and she felt lonely. But now she's not sad anymore. What helped? Jane asked. She married again, and now I have a new daddy. Look, there he is now. A tall man wearing a black frock coat, hat, and gray trousers strolled towards them while whistling a merry tune. The little girl waved excitedly, and in response, the man waved back with a mahogany cane in his hands. The man had kind blue eyes and short blonde hair. Jane guessed him to be perhaps a few years older than her, and judging by his clothes and the way he carried himself, Jane thought that he was wealthy. Jane also thought for a second that the man looked vaguely familiar, but she couldn't for the life of her place him. She had always been good at remembering faces, but less so when it came to names which had caused quite some embarrassment over the years. In fact, Jane remembered the first time Sarah had introduced her to a friend she had not yet met, but absolutely could not remember her name. Jane guessed her name, but it turned out to be the name of somebody with whom the woman had quarreled. Jane Mellor was a woman to whom money mattered little. She valued the simple pleasures of life that were often overlooked by others. Such pleasures as a perfectly brewed cup of tea, or a fall afternoon with the orange hues of the sun turning all the leaves into apparitions bathed in gold. Jane believed with all her heart that ordinary and everyday moments should be treasured as having immeasurable value. However, Jane also understood the importance and security that money brought. That had been one of the concerns after George's death. Jane had no family to turn to or anyone who would take her in. Had it not been for the money George had left her, Jane feared the possibility of having to face entering the doors of a poorhouse. The poorhouse was everyone's worst nightmare. Jane had heard several stories about widowed women who were sent to the poorhouse with their children. More often than not, they'd been separated from their children, forced to work long hours and sleep very little. Even though she was a widow, Jane could not imagine a fate worse than living out her remaining days in such a condition. She would not allow herself to stoop to such a level of life, knowing too that no one wanted that for her, not even her father, with whom she did not have a good relationship. "Clara, stop pestering this young lady," said the man as he stopped by the bench. "I do beg your pardon, miss." The little girl, Clara, pouted, and Jane couldn't help but chuckle. "Oh, it's no bother at all," Jane assured him. "In fact, I am glad for the company. I was just telling her how Mommy was sad before she met you and that now she is happy again. Oh, I know. Perhaps it will work for you as well. If you marry again, maybe you will not be sad anymore." "Clara, you are being rude," the man warned, but Jane didn't mind. In fact, something about Clara's suggestion struck a chord with Jane. She knew that it was common for widows to remarry after their husbands' deaths. Jane had just never considered that it might be an option for her. "Maybe you won't be sad anymore." The little girl's words echoed in Jane's mind, and a feeling stirred which she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. For such a small word, it still held much power. Jane avoided using it for fear of jinxing herself with bad luck. She had too much respect for the powers that be and did not see a reason to challenge that which she did not quite understand. Yet, a tiny fragment of hope lingered in the back of her mind, like a vague beacon of light at the end of a dark cave from which one feared never being free from. Jane wanted to know more. "Clara, may I ask?" Jane began. "How did your mother meet your new daddy?" "Oh, I can answer that," offered the man as he locked eyes with Jane. "The New York Times has a matrimonial Times section for advertisements. I had advertised for a suitable woman to wed. Clara's mother replied, and within a few weeks of exchanging letters, we were engaged. I know it is not my business to pry, Miss Jane Mellor. Miss Mellor. As I said, it is not my wish to pry, but my daughter is right. Perhaps searching the matrimonial Times might help you find joy again. Now it has been a pleasure to meet you, but I am afraid we must carry on our way. Come, Clara." "Bye. I hope we meet again," Clara waved excitedly as she jumped off the bench and hurried to catch up with her father. Jane waved back, and it was not long before Clara and her father disappeared around a corner. Somehow, Clara's words about her mommy finding happiness again resonated with Jane. She wanted more than anything to be happy again. She wanted with all her heart to love again. Jane had once thought that she would never love anyone as much as she had loved George, and for some time after his death, Jane also became convinced that she would never be happy again. That's not what George would have wanted. Deep inside, Jane knew that George would want her to find a way to be happy again. He would also want her to be cared for and looked after instead of being frightened and lonely. At that moment, as the afternoon sun slowly began to make its descent below the horizon to give way for the moon, Jane Mellor made a decision. She was going to love again. Perhaps the next time she saw Sarah, she could speak with her and ask her advice. Yes, that was a good idea. Unlike Jane, Sarah was definitely the very epitome of a social butterfly. Every time they were out on walks or dining together, there were always people who knew Sarah. They would come up to her and ask after her family. At times, those people who knew Sarah's husband happily praised his good work and commented on how proud she must be to have married such a man as him. Jane knew that Sarah was proud of her husband. They had been married for several years and were very happy together. Jane trusted nobody more to give her honest advice and to share thoughts on what Jane ought to do than Sarah. She knew she could rely on her friend no matter what happened. For the first time in a year, the smile that tugged at Jane's lips was genuine, and she felt excitement. She was going to be all right, after all, just as George would have wanted for her. If she ever met Clara again, Jane would make sure to thank her for her suggestion. Chapter 1. For the first time in a year, Jane felt a lightning bolt of excitement rush through her body when she opened the door to her apartment. It was as though she suddenly saw everything in a new light, and the heavy weight of grief that had been a constant part of her life for so long now seemed to at last lift. Jane would always love George, but she knew in her heart that George would want her to be happy and looked after. So it was then that on the way from the park, Jane purchased a copy of the Matrimonial Times. She had walked to the newspaper vendor and was about to purchase a copy of the New York Times when something struck her eye. The Matrimonial Times. It was stuck on a high shelf behind other titles. Instead, she purchased that. She put the newspaper on the kitchen table to set the copper kettle on the stove. It was usual for Jane to enjoy a cup of tea in the afternoon, but today called for a celebration. She unearthed a special blend that she had been gifted by a dear friend on her birthday the previous year. After the kettle had whistled and Jane had poured the tea into the blue china cup, she finally sat down to carefully read through the placements in the Matrimonial Times. This was not the first time Jane had flicked through the content of the Matrimonial Times, but not for herself. Her friend Phoebe had been set on finding a husband and had often shown Jane the advertisements for potential matches. At the time, Jane had found them rather amusing and wondered how one could possibly tell anything about someone from a few sentences on a page. However, she recalled that Phoebe began exchanging letters with a gentleman out west, and it wasn't long before she relocated to marry as a mail-order bride. If memory served her right, Jane recalled that Phoebe and her husband had been married for a few years now. She didn't know much about their life, but Jane knew that they had 2 children and perhaps one more on the way. As she carefully scanned the advertisements on each page, often rereading them once or twice, Jane began to feel a little overwhelmed. So many men needing wives? She couldn't help but to wonder why so many need to place advertisements. Calm yourself, Jane, she thought as she sipped the perfectly brewed tea. Jane closed her eyes and exhaled calmly. She was making things much too complicated, and she knew that they needn't be. Jane opened her eyes again, thinking she ought perhaps to take a little break and come back to it later. As she pushed her chair back and got up, Jane upset her cup of tea, which immediately began to soak the pages of the newspaper. No! As quickly as she could, Jane put a towel on the table and managed to save at least a little section of the newspaper. Once the paper had dried, she might be able to make out some of the writing, but she might just as well buy a new copy tomorrow. Perhaps it was just as well that she took a break for the evening. Even though her apartment was small, it gathered dust incredibly efficiently. Jane had been meaning to give it a thorough dusting and cleaning, but she had simply had other things on her mind, but now seemed as good a time as any. While most people dreaded having to clean, Jane really enjoyed it and found it relaxing. She always turned on the gramophone and dusted the apartment while humming to herself, imagining attending a ball in a fancy palace somewhere in the world. Perhaps her neighbors found it annoying, but sometimes it was truly the simple pleasures in life that made all the difference. As she was about to fold the newspaper, an advertisement just in the corner caught her attention, which had been spared the spilled tea. She could easily have ignored it, but Jane's attention was sparked. This is what it read. Matrimony. A Texan gentleman, 30 years of age and of a respectable rank in life, with ownership of a large ranch including estates and cattle. Now a widower, eager to start a family, seeks to correspond with a young lady of Christian belief who is prepared to move out west. Respond to this address. Mr. Daniel Harper. Jane read that advertisement a few times over. There was nothing special about it. It wasn't particularly long or even particularly informative. Yet something about it aroused Jane's curiosity, and somehow she just knew that this was the advertisement to which she would reply. After all, what was the worst that could happen? It was a very short advertisement and virtually told Jane nothing much about this man, other than that his name, Daniel Harper, and that he was a widower who wished to find a wife and start a family. There was nothing more about his interests other than his occupation in Texas. Then again, that is what letter writing was for, and surely once somebody began to reveal details about themselves, the rest would be easy. Jane had always adored writing letters. Expressing oneself through writing was a gift she had been blessed with already as a young child. She and her cousin, who lived elsewhere in the country, were not able to see each other too often, and they had kept in touch through letter writing all the way into adulthood. Jane wondered what her cousin would say about her plans to find a new match through the advertisements in the Matrimonial Times. Perhaps after she was done cleaning, she would write to her cousin, as it was her turn to reply. Texas was about as out west as one could travel. Jane had never so much as left New York City. She had heard stories of Texas, which to her seemed almost like another world entirely to the one she was used to. In the city, Jane knew exactly what to expect. She knew the buildings and the streets she walked. It had been her home her entire life, and it was where she felt safe. That's why Jane knew she had to take a leap of faith. She knew that the world was so much larger than could ever be put into words. She had heard stories of other people's travels during teas at Sarah Manning's house. However, hearing it from someone else was not at all the same as experiencing it firsthand. Jane wanted to explore and to be the one to tell other people her stories, but if she was to do that, she had to be brave and take the first step. That's how, on another cold winter's evening, Jane Mellor began writing letters to Mr. Daniel Harper in Savior Springs, Texas. Jane knew next to nothing about Texas other than what she'd read in newspapers or heard from other people. She knew that a year earlier, several large fires had all but destroyed most of downtown Dallas. At first, it was assumed that the fires had been a result of a particularly hot summer. It later turned out that the fires were intentionally fueled by less benevolent motives. Jane also knew that the weather in Texas was quite different from the weather in New York. Apparently, snow was extremely rare, whereas New York was covered in snow during the winter months. She had fortunately kept the fine writing paper George had bought her in the cabinet. Jane and George had never exchanged letters because they met through mutual acquaintances, and once they were married, had hardly spent any time apart. Theirs had truly been love at first sight. Jane rested the tip of the quill on the parchment and began to scribe. At first, she struggled to come up with the words to write, but after a few moments of pondering the right words and phrases, she let her hand rest gently on the table and then wrote. Dear Mr. Harper, I write this letter to you in response to your advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. I read the advertisement with great curiosity and decided to enter into correspondence. I am a widow whose husband died in a factory accident a year ago. I feel now is the time to move on, which I believe you can relate to. I must admit that this is my first attempt at a response to an advertisement, and so you must forgive me if my etiquette is in any way improper. I live in New York and have done so all my life. In fact, I have never left the state and am hoping to expand my horizons, as it were. Sometimes I dream of traveling abroad and visiting other countries. I would love to one day maybe stroll the streets of Paris or visit Venice. I am not certain I will ever have the opportunity to visit those places, but one can indeed dream. I have never been to Texas, so please indulge me. Please tell me about Texas. What do you look for in a potential bride? I apologize for perhaps appearing somewhat forward. I simply wish to get to know you. Yours sincerely, Mrs. Jane Mellor. Jane put the quill away and fetched an envelope while she waited for the ink to dry. The last thing she wanted was for Daniel Harper to open a letter only for it to be smudged and illegible. Strolling to the post office just around the corner from the tenement to mail the letter would make for a nice outing. It only took a few minutes for Jane to pop the envelope into the post office and return to her apartment. That night, she fell asleep with a considerably lightened heart and a smile on her face. Chapter 2. Patience had never been among Jane's virtues. Even as a little girl, she had never been good at waiting. It was especially difficult when she was looking forward to a happening. However, Jane knew that it was always best to keep herself busy instead of just anxiously waiting. So Jane did just that, just for the next few weeks, kept herself busy. She took long walks, either alone or accompanied by Sarah Manning. She wrote in her journal or sewed, depending on what took her fancy. Whenever she walked through Central Park alone, which was often, she played a game with herself. If she met people walking past her in the park, she would guess how they knew each other based on their interactions. Were they perhaps a husband and wife taking a rare break from child raising? Perhaps they were siblings scheming a celebration party of some sort for their parents. Jane knew that she would never get an answer to those questions, but that was the whole point. Jane wasn't certain exactly how long it would take for the letter to arrive in Texas, but she assumed it would take at least a number of weeks for Daniel Harper to receive the letter, read it, and then send a reply. Then again, what if he didn't reply with a letter of his own? What if he read Jane's letter and found her boring and not someone he might wish to correspond with? No, Jane couldn't allow herself to be so negative and worried. So, when the mail finally arrived on a Thursday morning, almost 3 weeks after posting her letter, Jane could hardly contain her excitement. In fact, she had to remind herself that the old lady, Miss Johnson, across the hall would get very cross indeed if Jane caused any kind of ruckus. Jane sat down at the kitchen table and held the envelope in her hand for a while, examining it carefully. It felt strange knowing that the letter within the envelope was not from her cousin or anyone she knew. Jane's mind was immediately filled with many questions. Was he a person who enjoyed writing long letters? Or did he prefer to keep them short and simple? What if he had only replied to tell her that he was not interested? She wanted to know the kind of man Daniel Harper was, and Jane was so excited she could hardly contain it. The first thing she noticed was that Daniel's handwriting was incredibly neat and elegant. He shaped the tail of his A's like a hook and kept his sentences quite short and to the point. Of course, one could not possibly know much about someone's personality simply by judging their way of writing, but Jane liked to hope. Madam, I was pleasantly surprised to receive your letter. Truthfully, I had started to wonder if perhaps my advertisement had the opposite effect to all I had wished. I am most grateful to you for having proved me wrong. I very much enjoyed reading your first letter, and you do not need to apologize for being forward. I much prefer a woman who speaks her mind and is sure of her opinions. Paris is indeed a magnificent city. There are not enough paintings in the world that could bring justice to its beauty. When I lived there, I always enjoyed walking along the River Seine after my morning coffee. I am glad to hear that you dream of traveling, because even though I have visited a couple of cities around the world, there are still a few I wish to see. I have only been to New York once, as a small child, and I confess that I do not recall much of my visit. However, I must admit that I am far fonder of the sanctity and freedom of the countryside. There is nothing quite so beautiful as sightseeing from one's position on horseback, I assure you. Do you also enjoy the outdoors? Your obedient servant, Mr. Daniel Harper. Jane read the letter again and again, and her heart fluttered excitedly every time. Daniel Harper had responded to her letter. That must mean that he at least found her interesting and wished to know more. Knowing that Daniel clearly enjoyed traveling and had seen more of the world was exciting. She wondered if he had any exciting stories of adventures he had experienced. Jane knew that she had to brace herself. There was no point in filling pages with all she wanted to ask about him. Jane's life wasn't extraordinary by any means, but she liked to think that she had plenty of experience and knew who she was as a person. Surely, that would be enough for a potential husband who wanted to get to know her. Forgetting her cup of tea altogether, Jane immediately fetched the writing paper and sat down with the pen to scribe her response. Dear Mr. Harper, I am delightfully pleased that you received my letter. Being my first correspondence so far away, I must confess to being a little nervous. I thought that perhaps my letter might somehow get lost along the way. I do indeed enjoy the outdoors, although I must confess that I have only left New York City once or twice as a small child. Although I am not certain that the Hamptons qualify as the countryside. I dare say most people who live there or choose to visit would not even know how to start a fire. I imagine that living in the countryside requires skills that one might not necessarily learn while living in a larger town. You must forgive my ignorance, but most stories I have heard about the West are those of outlaws and cowboys. It sounds a great deal more exciting than New York City. As a little girl, I took a pony ride in Central Park, but I have never actually been horseback riding. Yours sincerely, Mrs. Jane Mellor. The letter had to be perfect, and so Jane reread every word with care. She did not want to come across as too forward, as she did not want to give Daniel the wrong impression of her. His response had been short, but Jane thought that she had a glimpse of the sort of person he was. Daniel Harper seemed like a man who was sure of himself, as well as a man who clearly loved his home. Jane hoped that she hadn't offended him by mentioning the stories of the West she'd read. The last thing Jane wanted was for Daniel to think she was a small-minded person who believed everything that she heard from others without having a mind of her own. That wasn't true, of course, and Jane knew that all too well. Once she had decided that the letter was good enough, she folded the paper and placed it in the envelope. Jane almost ran to the post office around the corner, as if that would somehow speed up the letter's arrival, which was, of course, ridiculous. This was a feeling Jane hadn't experienced in a while. When she got back to her own apartment and sat in front of her mirror to brush her hair, Jane realized that she was excited and perhaps even happy. She had something new to look forward to, and she knew that if she truly did her best, she would soon have a new life and could leave the old one behind. It wasn't that she didn't love New York City. After all, it had always been her home. Deep inside, Jane knew that in order to be truly happy again and live a fulfilled life, she would have to move and make new memories elsewhere. And that's what she decided to do. That night, Jane slept more soundly than she had in a good long while. Ever since George's death, her sleep had been anything but peaceful, and she would wake at least once. Now she had dreams that were more peaceful, and she woke feeling rested and energized, ready to take on the world. Chapter 3. For the next week or so, Jane made sure to make the most of her days and got out of bed early so that she would not miss the mail delivery. She still couldn't believe that Daniel had actually responded with a letter into which he had clearly put a lot of thought. Surely, that must mean he was a good man and not somebody vain or shallow. She felt excited and anxious to hear from Daniel again and hoped that he would divulge more information and stories of his life in Texas. Owning a ranch with acres of land as well as cattle was a different reality to the one which Jane was used to. She'd never imagined herself as a rancher's wife, but as she sat in her favorite armchair and leaned back to close her eyes, she could easily do just that. out on the ever-stretching plains of the west, with the heat of the afternoon sun shining down on them. Perhaps she would be waiting for Daniel to return home after a long and arduous day of work with freshly homemade lemonade. Perhaps he would ask her about her day and listen intently to her stories. Even if Jane didn't have stories of her own, she could always read out loud. George had always loved Jane to read aloud from her favorite books, like the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. If she wasn't reading fairy tales or fables, Jane very much enjoyed reading poetry aloud and the works of Shakespeare. Then again, Daniel might very well turn out to be a man who did not much care for literature or reading. Jane wasn't awfully particular about the interests a potential match should show, but sharing some common ground certainly made for more enjoyment. Daniel's advertisement had mentioned that he was keen to start a family, but Jane had not previously given this much thought. She and George had spoken about having children, and if Jane was honest, she had certainly been looking forward to becoming a mother. The idea lingered in Jane's mind for some time one morning as she was finishing her breakfast. George had desperately wanted children, but he had also wished to wait until he had saved a little money from his wages at the factory. That money had now been passed on to Jane, although she had been rather frugal with her spending since George's passing. Jane Mellor was a woman of simple pleasures who did not require much to be quite content with life. Finally, the mail arrived bringing the much-anticipated letter from Daniel, which she eagerly opened at the kitchen table, as had become tradition. "Madam, I read your response with great pleasure, and I admit that your comment about the Hamptons made me laugh, and that is no small feat, I assure you. To answer your question, yes, the West can be dangerous if you are not careful and do not have your wits about you, but that can certainly also be true of most places. I, for one, have heard many stories of troublesome types in New York who go out of their way to cause harm. Rest assured, madam, you will find no unsavory types of the sort here in Savior Springs. It is a quaint town with people who enjoy the simple pleasures of life and the fresh air of the countryside. The people here are very hospitable and curious about those who choose to visit. In all my years of living here, I have yet to meet somebody I did not care for. Besides, there is nothing better to soothe the mind and the soul. I am, of course, somewhat biased in my beliefs, as I'm sure you can understand. We have ponies and horses, among the most beautiful creatures on God's green earth. Indulge me, madam, if you will. How do you spend your free time? I look forward to your response. Your obedient servant, Mr. Daniel Harper." Jane was ecstatic and wanted to jump up and down, but had to compose herself. Not only was this letter much longer than the previous one, but it also showed more of Daniel's personality. Jane thought that he seemed to be a man with a great sense of humor, which was important, but also a man who loved his home and his people, not to mention the fact that he wanted to know about her and what she did in her spare time. Jane made herself a cup of tea, fetched the writing paper and a pen, and sat down to write. This letter needed to be more detailed than her introduction, and Jane thought carefully about what to write and how much to share. That week had not been a particularly exciting one, but there were other matters to mention. "Dear Mr. Harper, firstly, there is no need to call me madam, even though it is very polite of you. I would prefer you called me Jane. I was terribly excited to see your letter in the post today. I am also a woman of simple pleasures, but I do have my hobbies, as one must. On Wednesdays, I visit my friend Sarah for afternoon tea along with the ladies in our neighborhood. We catch up and talk about the various goings-on in town. Sarah is a very dear friend, and we have known each other for a good many years. She hosts weekly afternoon teas with the local ladies in our community, which is always a lovely affair. She assures me that there is nothing quite like watching the sun go down over a Texan horizon. Sarah has family in Dallas, who she sometimes visits when she is able. I enjoy keeping a journal. I find it very relaxing to write my thoughts and reflect upon them at a later time. Of course, I enjoy reading and sewing as well. I am quite capable of mending clothes as well as sewing for myself and others. Savior Springs sounds like a lovely town, and I truly hope that you were not offended by my mention of those stories. If so, I apologize. It was not my intention to hurt your feelings. I would be interested to learn more about the cattle you keep. Do you see wild animals on your ranch? I look forward to your reply. Yours sincerely, Mrs. Jane Mellor. Jane was a little worried that Daniel might have been offended due to her ignorance. But after reading the letter a couple of times over, she decided it was not the case. She felt happy with her own response and carefully folded the letter and placed it in the envelope. Before Jane fell asleep that night, she closed her eyes and imagined a new life filled with things she could never have imagined. It was only a feeling, but even so, deep inside, Jane Mellor knew that her life was about to change. Instead of being frightened of those changes, she decided to embrace them. And so, with thoughts of acres of farmland and the sound of horses galloping, it did not take long before Jane fell asleep. Chapter 4. For some time, the routine continued unchanged. Jane would receive a letter from Daniel, each one longer than the next. Although Daniel finally referred to her by her Christian name only after 2 more letters, asking her to call him Daniel in return, which seemed only fair. Jane definitely shouldn't have worried about struggling with conversation. In fact, her letters to Daniel became so lengthy that Jane soon realized she had run out of writing paper on which to pen her replies. Having something to look forward to and getting to know someone new made such a difference to Jane's mood. She was much happier than she had been in a while, and she felt as if she was starting to be herself again. The person she had been before losing George. Correspondence was going well, and Jane felt hopeful. But there was still no mention from Daniel's side about a potential marriage match. Were they to simply keep exchanging letters with no intention of meeting? Had he grown tired of her already and just did not have the courage to tell her so? How long did it usually take for correspondence to turn into an actual engagement? It became clear to Jane that these were all matters of which she knew little, but which she also had not considered until then. Should she perhaps bring it to Daniel's attention in case he had forgotten? No, that would seem awfully forward and would certainly not work in Jane's favor. The very last thing she wanted was to scare him off, and so she decided to bite her tongue. To Jane's relief, when the next letter arrived from Daniel, its content was exactly what Jane had hoped for. Daniel stated his intent to marry and asked Jane to be his bride. If she chose to accept his proposal, he would send the money for her train fare and would be delighted to meet her in Savior Springs. My dear Daniel, of course I accept your proposal. It would be my great honor to become your wife. Butterflies seem to have taken up permanent residence inside my stomach, and I cannot wait to meet you in Savior Springs. I have some matters to attend to in New York, but it should be no trouble at all to arrive after Christmas. I cannot wait to begin our lives anew. Yours truly, Jane. Perhaps her reply was a little short considering its importance, but Jane had so many thoughts in her mind that she just thought it best to be to the point. She couldn't wait to tell Sarah about this new development. Before she had taken to writing to Daniel, Jane dreaded spending another Christmas alone. This time, however, would be different. Sarah had invited Jane to spend Christmas with her and her family, and it would be the perfect time to announce her news. Sarah knew that Jane had been corresponding with Daniel, but she did not yet know about his proposal. She wanted to keep it secret for a while, worrying that if she told anyone, it would break the magic spell which had been cast over her. Jane was a little nervous, however. She had never made such a long journey, and she had never been on a train. She knew Sarah had traveled outside of New York, and so she would make sure to ask her about it. There was so much that Jane did not know, and while it all felt a little frightening, she knew it was all a part of her journey towards finding happiness. George used to say that if something was scary, then it meant it was worth doing, and Jane couldn't help but think that he was right. Chapter 5. Jane could not wait to share her news about Daniel's proposal. There was much to prepare for, and many practicalities Jane had to take care of. Sarah and Jane had agreed to meet up for a walk around Central Park the following day. A part of Jane wondered if she might see the little girl again. It was highly unlikely, but stranger things had occurred, and Jane wanted a chance to say thank you. Maybe it was silly, but Jane wondered if the powers that be had sent Clara as a way of letting Jane know that her life would be fine and that she would find happiness again. Maybe there was something magical to it all that she hadn't considered. Even if it was just pure coincidence, Jane still chose to believe that fate had intervened as it so often did in stories. "How exciting for you, Jane!" Sarah exclaimed as they turned right to follow a small path past a garden, of which Jane was particularly fond. "Truly, I am delighted for you. I know this past year has been difficult. You deserve happiness." Hearing Sarah's reaction to Jane's proposal was a relief. It was not as though Jane needed her approval, but it would certainly make it less difficult to leave New York. Jane and Sarah had been friends for the better part of 10 years, and were indeed almost sisters to one another. In fact, it was Sarah who had introduced her and George. Jane would go so far as to say that Sarah was the only real family she had left in the world. Jane had never had a good relationship with her father, and he had always behaved abominably towards her. After her mother died, Jane did not see a point in keeping a close relationship with her father, especially not after meeting and marrying George. Jane remembered the day she met George down to the very last detail. Sarah had been hosting a social event, a picnic in the summer. Jane had not been feeling particularly motivated to attend, but as was always the case, Sarah convinced her. It would be good for her, she had said. Who knows, she might meet somebody who took her by surprise. It should have been obvious to Jane that Sarah had, of course, already had George in mind when she mentioned the event. It was rather annoying that she had been right. Once George and Jane were introduced, they spent almost all evening conversing with each other. Jane loved Sarah with all her heart, but she did have a tendency to be immensely proud of her achievements, and so when George proposed to Jane, it was Sarah who could not stop talking about it. "I shall expect a wedding invitation, of course," said Sarah with certainty. "John has family out west, and it would be a lovely holiday indeed." "I am certain that Daniel will not mind me having guests," Jane replied. "Certainly not my dearest friend." Jane could tell that her compliment turned Sarah's cheek a little red. Even though they were close friends, Jane and Sarah were very different. Sarah was more outspoken than perhaps was common for a woman of her standing. She had never been afraid of speaking her mind, and sometimes did so without considering the consequences beforehand. Jane, however, was quieter and more reserved. It wasn't that she was shy or unable to speak her mind about things that mattered to her. It was just that Jane had never been one to enjoy being the center of attention. In fact, Jane had always preferred having a few close friends that she knew really well, instead of several friends of a more shallow nature. "Have you decided when you are leaving New York yet?" Sarah asked curiously as they passed the bench that marked the spot where Jane had met Clara, directly across from the little pond. Jane looked around her, hoping she might see Clara and her stepfather, but sadly there was nobody else there except for a lady walking a dog. "Not a precise date," Jane confessed, in prosody. "But we have decided that I shall leave New York after Christmas. I told Daniel that you had very kindly invited me to spend Christmas with your family, and I would not miss that for the world, especially if it is to be the last Christmas we see each other for some time." "Indeed, and it might well be your last snowy Christmas. I am quite certain that there will not be much chance of snow in Texas." A chuckle escaped Jane's lips. She would miss these walks and conversations with Sarah. She always had a way of making her laugh. Having friends with whom you could be entirely honest and your true authentic self was a blessing that Jane would always keep close to her heart, no matter what happened in life. "Daniel tells me that there is nothing quite like a picnic at the waterside on a Texan summer's day," Jane continued. "He seems to be quite the romantic, which is not what I expected after reading his advertisement." "Well, I do hope that he lives up to his words," said Sarah. "He sounds like a perfectly lovely man, and I do wish you the very best, even though I shall miss you dearly. You must remember to write often." Jane nodded and promised Sarah that she would write as soon as she arrived in Savior Springs. They strolled for a while longer, talking about all manner of topics that might have made no sense to any passerby. Finally, after almost an hour had passed, Sarah and Jane said their goodbyes. "I mean it, you know," confirmed Sarah. "I truly do hope that he makes you happy. You deserve nothing less, especially after all that has happened. It is what Daniel would want for you." Jane knew that Sarah was right. Chapter 6. To Jane, time always seems slow to pass, particularly when looking forward to an anticipated event. Now, however, was the exact opposite. Time flew by far too quickly, and before Jane knew it, she found herself standing on a platform at New York Station with a bag on either side of her. For the occasion, Jane had chosen to wear her very finest clothes, a long dark green dress with a domed skirt. Over the dress, she wore a coat of a similar color as well as a white bonnet. The bonnet was her favorite item because she had inherited it from her mother a very long time ago. Wearing it reminded Jane of her mother, and she hoped that wherever she was, she would be proud and smiling down at her from above. "Now, are you sure you've got everything you need?" Sarah asked. Ever since leaving Sarah's home, where Jane had been staying, her friend had not stopped fussing to make sure Jane had whatever she needed. She was very kind and thoughtful, and so Jane did not mind. She simply smiled and assured Sarah that she would be perfectly all right. "Okay, now then," Sarah continued. "Make sure the conductor knows your stop, because he will remind you when you are approaching. It is a long journey, and if you sit down all through it, your legs will suffer when you finally arrive. Even if I tell you that I know these things, you will not stop fussing, will you?" Jane teased. Sarah shook her head and tears began to form in her eyes. This surprised Jane because for as long as they had known each other, she had only once seen her friend cry, and that was during Jane and George's wedding. "I will miss you greatly," said Sarah. "Truly, I wish you a very safe journey, and I shall await news of your safe arrival. Goodbye, Jane." "Goodbye, Sarah. Thank you for being a true friend all these years." The two friends hugged each other before Jane climbed aboard the train. Watching Sarah grow ever smaller as the train rolled out of the station, she knew that from now on, things would be very different. Chapter 7. Had Jane been told that when she was 24 years of age, she'd be traveling across the country to another state to be married, she would have laughed. In fact, in Jane's mind, she had always thought that she'd never leave New York. It was the city in which she had been born, and she thought, the city in which she would surely have died at an old age. Instead, she was a passenger in the train car, looking out of the window at the landscape passing by. There had been many people at the station, and Jane wondered where they were traveling to. Just like she did in the park, Jane tried to guess the relationships between the people walking past her compartment. Some were old, and others were young. There were families with young children who were excited to be on such an incredible adventure. It was a long journey, and Jane had books to read, sewing to do, and of course, her journal in which to write. She did not know whether someone would be sharing her compartment, but for now, she had it all to herself. Watching New York grow smaller was a strange experience. After a few hours, Jane thought that she could just watch the landscape pass by without ever getting bored. As a way to pass time, she reached into one of her bags for her journal and a pencil. She flipped to an empty page, but instead of keeping the journal vertically, she turned it so that the page was horizontal, and then she began to sketch the landscape on view outside the window. Jane was by no means an artist. However, she did enjoy focusing on a sketch without having to keep an eye on how much time had passed. Usually, she would sit on a bench in the park and capture the scene around her, everything from the pond where she had met young Clara to the gardens through which she strolled with Sarah and the flock of pigeons seeking out treats to feed on. The first time Jane had ever put a pencil to paper was when she was a little girl. One of the few memories she had of her mama was watching her sitting in an armchair, quietly sketching while looking out the window and waiting for Jane's father to come home after a late night. Jane liked to think that she might have inherited her talent to draw from her mama, but there was, of course, no way to know for sure. "Pardon me, miss," came an unfamiliar voice. "Is this seat taken?" Jane looked up from her sketch to see a young woman around her age standing in the doorway. She was dressed modestly in a long sky blue dress and carried 2 bags with her, just like Jane. "Not at all," Jane replied. "Please sit. Shall I help you with those bags?" "Oh, that would be awfully kind of you." A few moments later, Jane had put the woman's bags on the overhead rack above the seats opposite her. The young woman sat down and exhaled wearily with a sigh as she leaned back into the seat. "Have you been on board for long?" the young woman asked curiously. "I departed from New York," Jane told her. "I am traveling to Texas." "Oh, how exciting. Are you visiting family?" "Actually, I am to be married to a Texan rancher." "How exciting. How did you meet?" "Oh, how terribly rude of me. I have not even introduced myself, and here I am asking intrusive questions. My name is Amelia Hardwick." "I am Jane Mellor, and you were not rude at all. Very pleased to meet you. Daniel and I have been corresponding for a good few months now, and he has more recently proposed marriage." Amelia's eyes grew wide, both with curiosity and a glint of awe. Surely Amelia must be aware of the matrimonial times, because it was not an unusual way of finding a potential spouse. However, the look in her eyes was one of a woman with many questions. To be fair, though, a few weeks ago Jane was that woman. "I have heard of women who move out west to marry and seek new fortunes, but I have never met one myself until now," said Amelia. "If I am truly honest," Jane admitted, "I would not have thought myself to be one of those women. However, my late husband passed away a year ago, and I believe he would have wanted me to move on with my life. How about you? Where are you traveling to?" "I am traveling to St. Louis to stay with my sister for a while. She has recently had a baby, and she needs some help around the house. Truthfully, I am looking forward to a change of scenery. Even cities such as Washington can feel like a small village where everybody knows everybody else's business, even if you wish they did not." Jane nodded and could certainly relate to that feeling about New York. Even though they had only spoken for a few minutes, Jane already liked Amelia. She was talkative and curious, but also very friendly. For every question that she asked Jane, she seemed to have no problem at all answering them about herself as well. Jane had never been one to enjoy small talk, but instead of chatting about the weather, she and Jane discussed all manner of topics. It was clear to Jane that Amelia was a very quick-witted and intelligent woman who was also very opinionated. She also found herself agreeing with Amelia on many of the topics they discussed, whether current affairs or relating to their hobbies. "It has been a genuine pleasure to meet you, Jane Mellor," Amelia said when they rolled in at the platform in St. Louis. "You will write to me when you reach Texas, won't you? I would love to hear about your adventures." "Of course," said Jane excitedly. "I would love to." With that, Amelia disembarked from the train, and a few moments later the train rolled out of the station, continuing on to its next destination. Chapter 8. The journey from New York to Texas felt never-ending. After Amelia had disembarked in St. Louis, Jane was left alone in the compartment, for which she was quite happy. Although she did miss having someone to talk to, she was quite comfortable with her own company. Besides, there was nothing dull about being on board a train. Jane was alone in her compartment, but she could still hear the hustle and bustle of the train. Now and again, someone walked past to stretch their legs, and Jane would sometimes catch a snippet of their conversation. Whenever the train stopped for passengers to disembark and board, Jane always found herself amazed by the difference in the landscape. She realized just how vast and majestic the country was and how little of it she had seen. Jane had never envisioned herself traveling to other countries. She was far too fond of home for that. Occasionally, though, she did daydream about a life in grand cities such as Paris or London. Even though Jane enjoyed the train journey, she had to admit that she was looking forward to sleeping in an actual bed again. If she found that her legs were sore from sitting down too long, Jane walked up and down her section of the train and sometimes stopped by a window to look out at the view around them. A few things surprised her about the train, which probably seemed silly to those who were used to train travel. One of the things that surprised Jane was the sheer speed of the train. She knew they were much faster than horseback, but having experienced it herself was different to hearing descriptions from others. The second thing that surprised Jane was the extent of the noise made by the train. Even though her cabin was far from the engine of the train, she could still hear it very well. She'd barely slept that first night because of the noise and the new impressions, but it was better now that she was used to it. It was almost hard to imagine that only a few years ago, the train didn't exist, and now it made travel to visit relatives easier who lived further away. It was a surprisingly sunny winter's day when the train rolled into the station at Savior Springs, Texas. Jane knew it wouldn't be snowy like New York, but the fact that it was almost like the heat of summer had caught her rather off guard. "This is it, Jane," she told herself, "your new life." Jane exhaled heavily to collect her reserve, after which she grabbed her bags and stepped off the train onto the platform. Other than her, only 2 people disembarked from the train. 2 men who seemed to be friends as they left the station together. Jane put her bags down beside her to take a look at her surroundings and familiarize herself with her new home. The station was tiny. In fact, it consisted of just a platform with one wooden bench and a small hut that seemed to serve as the ticket office. It wasn't even manned. Jane knew that Savior Springs would be nothing like New York or the other large cities, but she hadn't expected it to be quite so isolated. However, even if something was new to begin with, it wouldn't take long before it became familiar. Jane simply had to give herself time to get used to it all. The other strange thing that Jane quickly noticed was that she was now completely alone at the station. It was strange because in their correspondence, Daniel had promised to meet her at the station. Yet Daniel was nowhere to be seen, and as far as Jane could tell, she was all alone on the platform. At first, a million different thoughts of possible what-if scenarios ran through Jane's mind. What if she had arrived in the wrong town? What if Daniel had changed his mind and she simply had not received a letter saying just that? For a while, Jane just stood on the platform and took it all in. There was no need to expect the worst, so she grabbed her carpet bag and started walking out of the station. Now, Jane Mellor was not a woman who struggled to manage by herself, such as carrying heavy bags. However, she was unaccustomed to the warmth of the Texan sun as well as the terrain of the dirt road leading into town. After about 20 minutes, Jane placed her bag beside her and looked up at the town in which she had just arrived. Savior Springs looked exactly the way Daniel had described it in his letters. There were 2 rows of buildings on either side of her. Most, if not all of them, were storefronts, and from what Jane could see, Savior Springs had all the amenities a small town could possibly need. There was a saloon a little further down the high street, as well as a tailor, a cobbler, and a general store. Quite a few people were out and about. A woman and her child walked past Jane and gave her a wary glance. Jane had never liked being the center of attention, and she was aware of how strange it must seem for a woman to just march into town with her bag of belongings. "Excuse me, miss." The voice belonged to a middle-aged gentleman with curly dark hair that fell just below his ears. He was smartly dressed in tailored pants and wore a vest and a frock coat. His eyes had a look of confusion mixed with curiosity. "Are you lost?" he asked carefully. "Oh, I should hope not," Jane replied in a friendly voice. "Although, perhaps you could help me. I am looking for Mr. Daniel Harper." At the mention of Daniel's name, the man winced in a way that didn't quite sit right with Jane. The stranger definitely knew Daniel, but something told Jane that perhaps they did not get along well. "If it is Mr. Harper you are looking for, miss," the man began. Jane corrected. "Jane Mellor. Please just call me Jane." "Miss Jane. Well, if you see the Marshal, Harry Unsworth, he will tell you the whereabouts of your Mr. Harper." "And where might I find the Marshal?" Even saying the word made her head spin. The Marshal. That could not be good. The gentleman spat out his tobacco and then turned around while gesturing for Jane to do the same. "See that building towards the end, just next to the post office? That's where you'll find the Marshal. Oh, and do tell him that Judd Knoxville would like to repay that favor with a drink at the saloon." "I will," Jane said. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Knoxville." "Oh, please call me Judd. You look after yourself now, Miss Jane." Jane promised she would, and once again picked up her carpet bag and made her way to the marshal's office. By the time she reached the marshal's office, Jane was absolutely exhausted. She hadn't slept well or comfortably throughout the train journey and would kill for a rest on a soft mattress. Unfortunately, Jane had a feeling that she would not be getting a rest for at least a little while until she figured out what had happened to Daniel. "Hello," Jane called out as she walked through the doors of the marshal's office. "I am looking for Mr. Unsworth." "Here," called a jolly voice, and Jane sighed with relief. "And who are you, young miss?" Harry Unsworth sat behind a desk reading a newspaper and smoking a pipe when Jane entered the room. He folded the newspaper and put it to one side as he looked up and met Jane's eyes. Just like Judd Knoxville, the marshal had the look of perplexion, as if he couldn't quite figure out what Jane was doing in town. Truthfully, Jane was starting to ask herself the same question and felt a bit like a fish out of water. "Good morning, miss," greeted the marshal cheerfully. "I don't believe I've seen you around town before. What brings you to Savior Springs?" "Is that obvious?" Jane chuckled. "Prosnautein. Well, we don't get many visitors hereabouts, especially not young ladies such as yourself, miss. How may I be of service?" "I am looking for a man by the name of Daniel Harper. I was told that you would be able to point me in his direction." At this, the marshal's eyebrows furrowed and the look in his eyes suddenly turned noticeably more serious. "And who was it that told you to find me?" he asked matter-of-factly as he crossed his arms. "Oh," Jane exclaimed. "A very kind gentleman. I believe his name was Judd Knoxville. That reminds me, he asked me to tell you that he wants to repay your favor with a drink." The marshal chuckled and seemed to relax a little more, adjusting his posture so that he was sitting more upright. "I'll be sure to take him up on that," the marshal said. "Now then, if I may be so bold, what business do you have with Daniel Harper?" "I have traveled from New York," Jane explained. "Daniel Harper and I have been corresponding by letter for quite some time now, and I am here because I am to be his wife." Jane wasn't sure exactly of the reaction she had expected from Harry Unsworth, but the look of disappointment mixed with concern in his eyes made Jane's heart drop. "I am sorry to be the one to tell you, miss," the marshal began. "Mellor, Jane Mellor," Jane filled in. "Please tell me what has happened." "I got the impression from Mr. Sass, Knoxville, that perhaps something is not quite right. Is Daniel okay? You have traveled a long way, and you seem like a sweet girl, Miss Mellor. Unfortunately, as the town's marshal, it is my duty to tell you a truth that might not be what you wish to hear." "I am quite certain I can handle whatever truth you wish to speak, sir." Inside, she wasn't quite so sure, but she had to know. The Marshal L walked around his desk and leaned just on the edge so that he was right in front of Jane. "You are not the first woman to arrive in Savior Springs with the intention of marrying Daniel Harper," he explained. "In fact, your arrival is the very reason he is in jail." "Jail?" Jane gasped. "Whatever for? Surely there must be a mistake of some kind." "There is no mistake, miss. Just like yourself, other women have traveled to Savior Springs with the hope of marrying Mr. Harper, only to find that he has rejected them." Even though Jane heard the words coming out of the marshal's mouth, it was as if her brain did not want to understand them. This did not match the personality of the same Daniel with whom Jane had been corresponding for weeks. Jane had the impression of a kind and hard-working man who had suffered losses in his life but had decided to start life anew by marrying again. In the letters Daniel had written to Jane, he explained that he wished to become a father one day and how he wanted to marry a woman who truly understood him. For weeks, Jane was certain that she was that woman and that they had connected during those weeks of correspondence. Could the words spoken by the marshal really be the truth? Had she allowed herself to be fooled? Jane could just about hear her father's angry voice in her mind, mocking her for making such foolish decisions. George, who had passed away, and now Daniel, who may or may not be a fraudster. "What happened to those other women?" Jane asked, keeping herself as calm and collected as always. The marshal was quiet for a few moments, as if he was silently pondering what to tell her. "Most of the girls took up work in the saloons," the marshal explained. "There's quite a few of them in the area." Surely a man is allowed to change his mind about marriage if he does not deem the bride suitable? Jane put to the lawman. Well, indeed, miss. It is, however, not right to lure a woman across the country with false intentions. Is Mr. Harper here right now? Yes, he is. May I speak with him? I do not believe that would be appropriate. Jane exhaled a frustrated sigh. She could feel the emotions bubbling inside her, and she wasn't sure what to do. She'd be lying if she said she wasn't upset. The man she thought she'd been getting to know was a liar and a charlatan. Most of all, Jane was angry with herself for being so gullible and trusting. She could easily imagine the look on her father's face if he ever found out, and he would surely mock her for it. Sarah might be more sympathetic towards her, but Jane did not want her friend to pity her. It's okay, Jane, she thought. Everything will be fine. Miss, why don't you sit down? Harry suggested. I'll get you a glass of water. Harry left the room to get her a drink of water, and her tears immediately began to well up and stream down Jane's face. She hated crying in front of people, especially ones she didn't know, because it made her feel vulnerable and exposed. At that moment, though, Jane was frightened. I'm so sorry, Jane apologized as she dried her tears. How terribly rude of me to barge into your office and then burst into tears. Oh, you needn't apologize, miss, Harry assured her as he put the glass of water on the desk. You've had a long journey and must be tired. There's an inn just up the road that has some rooms available. I know the landlady's family, and if you mention my name, she'll give you a discount. Thank you. Jane dried the last of her tears and took a sip of water. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but she thought the water tasted differently from New York's water. It was almost fresher. I'll walk you over to the inn, Harry offered. Oh no, I couldn't possibly take up more of your time, Mr. Unsworth, Jane protested. Harry, please. Mr. Unsworth was my father's name. Harry, thank you for telling me the truth about Mr. Harper and for being so kind. I assure you that I am not usually like this. You are right, though. A good rest will definitely do me some good. At first, it looked as though Harry was about to protest again, but he closed his mouth instead and sighed in defeat. All right then, miss, he said. Good luck. Thank you. Harry nodded and tipped his hat, and just like that, Jane was out the door again with her carpet bag in one hand. Hopefully, the inn would be quiet and she could rest for a couple of hours. However, she also needed to make plans to figure out what to do next. While Jane didn't know exactly what to do, she did know that it would not be easy. Whatever happened, though, she knew one thing for certain. She was in need of a good meal after the bread she had taken on the train. Chapter 9. Just as the Marshal said, the landlady of the inn, Mrs. Keeling, was a kind woman. From the moment Jane walked in through the doors, Mrs. Keeling saw that she was exhausted and immediately helped her to check into a room. In fact, she even drew a hot bath that was ready for Jane to soak in as soon as she had settled. The room Jane was assigned was small, to say the least. It had a single bed, a small bedside table, a desk, and a chest of drawers. Its only small window faced the high street, which was starting to show increased signs of life. Being in a new town was a strange feeling, and Jane didn't like the situation she'd found herself in. She couldn't possibly blame anyone but herself, because her decisions had led her to this very moment. She could just about hear her father's laughter echoing like thunder in her head. The bath was exactly what Jane needed. Just lying in the tub and allowing her body to absorb the water while she inhaled the lovely flowery scents, Jane was ready to all but fall asleep while soaking. After the bath, she thanked Mrs. Keeling for her kindness. Mrs. Keeling, who wore her graying hair in a knot and was dressed in a lovely dark blue dress, simply smiled at her. You remind me of my daughter, Mrs. Keeling had said. She has recently married and now lives in Chicago. The landlady told Jane a little more about her daughter, and even though she was tired, Jane hadn't the heart to interrupt the older lady. When Jane asked where she could eat, Mrs. Keeling kindly offered to Jane a serving of her homemade stew. Had Mrs. Keeling offered her nothing more than gruel, Jane would have devoured it with relish to satisfy her growling stomach, being that she was entirely fed up with a diet of bread. About an hour later, With her stomach filled by the tastiest stew she had ever eaten, Jane crawled between the sheets on the bed and fell asleep before her head so much as settled on the pillow. She was still upset about Daniel and overwhelmed by everything that had happened since her arrival in Savior Springs. But knowing that there were kind people like Mrs. Keeling had Jane feeling more relaxed. Imic Dinkus Palatino. It was dark outside when Jane woke up. She had only intended to sleep for a couple of hours, but she must have needed the rest. Jane often dreamt very vividly, but she had slept to wake with no memory of any dreams when she opened her eyes. She must have needed the sleep more than she thought, and her muscles had definitely taken somewhat of a beating after having slept so uncomfortably on the train journey. Jane stifled a yawn before sitting up. After all that had happened, she had more than a great deal to think over. Daniel, the man with whom she had been corresponding and shared her life story, was a confidence trickster. That was the simple truth of it. And even though Jane wished there had been a mistake or a misunderstanding of some kind, she knew in her heart that all the Marshal had told her was true. The question remaining was an important one. What was she to do? The simple answer, and perhaps the safest, would be for Jane to simply buy a ticket in the morning for the next train back to New York. She would, of course, have to face the embarrassment of admitting her folly. Jane knew that Sarah would be kind and understanding about it. She could hear her friend telling her that these things happen more often than one might think, and that Jane need not blame herself. It was the other women in their social circle who worried Jane. Some of them were less kind-hearted and loved tasty morsels of gossip. In New York, and certainly other places as well, gossip was worth its weight in gold, a fact that Jane knew all too well. Jane knew that if she went back to New York, she would have to deal with the repercussions of her mistakes. Going back to New York also meant going home to a familiar and safe place, but one also filled with sad memories. What if, Jane thought, she didn't go back to New York? What if, despite everything, she stayed in Savior Falls? Sure, it was a small town and life here was very different from life in New York, but at least here she didn't know anyone. She could start life over and make her own way in the world, even without a husband. Mrs. Keeling owned an inn and was a very successful businesswoman by the looks of things, so why should Jane not try to do the same? In the morning, Jane would make sure to ask Mrs. Keeling if there was any work to be had in town, or perhaps even at the inn. She had some money saved that would last her a few months, but beyond that Jane would need a plan. Yes, she thought, that would be a good start. Chapter 10. Good morning, Jane. Did you sleep well? Jane had, to her surprise, slept very well indeed. At first she thought it would be difficult to sleep through the night after having slept in the day, but that wasn't the case. Jane had fallen asleep again, to even have some dreams that she vaguely recalled in the morning as the first rays of sunshine peered through the window. I slept like a log, Jane replied. A bath and the stew truly did wonders. Thank you so much. Oh, it's no bother at all, dear, said Mrs. Keeling with a smile. What will you be doing today, if you don't mind me asking? I don't mind at all. Actually, I wanted to ask whether you know of any work opportunities available right now. I think I'll be staying in town for a while. Mrs. Keeling said nothing at first. Her eyebrows furrowed as if she was pondering the answer to Jane's question. There's a mercantile just across the road, Mrs. Keeling said. It's run by Mr. Browning, who is a lovely man. However, between you and I, he is getting older and can't quite run the business on his own anymore. Tell him that I sent you, and I'm sure he'll be happy to offer you some work. Thank you so much, Jane said. Everyone here is so kind. It's no bother at all, dear. Savior Springs is the kind of town where everyone is welcome. Now then, would you like some breakfast before you go out? Yes, please. That would be lovely. Break Dinkus Palatino das Green. After breakfast, which consisted of oatmeal and a cup of tea since Jane had never liked coffee, Jane decided to explore what there was to see in Savior Springs. She felt more relaxed now that she had made the decision to remain in the town. The locals were friendly, and Jane was certain that if she did her best and was kind to others, Savior Springs would be a good place for her to settle. even without a husband. In New York, everything was big and sometimes you had to walk for quite a while before reaching your destination. In Savior Springs, it was the exact opposite. The mercantile Mrs. Keeling had mentioned was literally a stone's throw from the inn. No wonder everyone felt so safe in a community where everything was so nearby. The open sign hung on the mercantile door, but when Jane carefully opened it, she was met by silence. "Hello? Is there anyone here?" she called out, wondering if perhaps she should come back later. The interior of the store was bigger than it seemed from the outside and stocked everything a mercantile could possibly need. There were shelves of pots and pans, as well as a wall display of canned goods. Cooking utensils and farm equipment were stacked and packed and displayed, constituting all that a rural area might need by way of supplies. Just as Jane was about to leave the store with the intention of returning later, she heard footsteps upstairs. A few moments later, a man she assumed to be Mr. Browning walked into the store. Mr. Browning appeared to be in his late 50s or early 60s. He was a somewhat stout man who wore black trousers and a white shirt under a brown waistcoat. A pair of round glasses rested on his nose, and Jane also noticed the silver chain of a fob watch in his pocket. "Good morning, dear," Mr. Browning greeted warmly. "I haven't seen your face in these parts before. Are you passing by Savior Springs?" "As it turns out, I moved here only yesterday," Jane explained, "from New York." Mr. Browning lifted his glasses and dusted them off with a handkerchief while he studied Jane. "New York?" he questioned. "You're a long way from New York. Choth, what brings you to our little corner of the world?" Jane told Mr. Browning about her journey from New York and all that had happened since she arrived in town. Browning listened intently to her story without interrupting, and when Jane had finished telling her story, there was a brief moment of silence between them. "You've had quite an adventure, dear," Mr. Browning chuckled, although there was no malice in his voice. "Are you sure you wish to remain in Savior Springs?" "Yes," Jane nodded. "I want to make a life for myself here. I think I could be very happy living here." "In that case, we had best think of getting you some work. I could certainly use a hand around the store if you don't mind that sort of thing." Jane was so relieved to hear those words from Mr. Browning. "I wouldn't mind at all," she beamed excitedly. "I'd be more than glad to help out. When can I start?" Mr. Browning laughed warmly and heartily at Jane's enthusiasm and was about to reply when the bell over the door rang, signaling someone entering the store. "Ah, Mr. Unsworth!" Mr. Browning exclaimed. "Your order hasn't arrived yet, I'm afraid. Perhaps tomorrow, if we are lucky." "Actually, I came to check in on Miss Mellor. I went to the inn, but Mrs. Keeling said that you were over here. I thought perhaps you had decided to go back to New York." This surprised Jane. Sure, the Marshal had been kind to her yesterday and helped her way more than he'd needed to, but Jane got the impression that she'd been rather a nuisance. Besides, she'd have thought that it must get terribly frustrating to always have to tell these women that the promise of marriage was nothing but fake. "I am sorry to disappoint you, Mr. Unsworth," said Jane, "but I have decided to stay in Savior Springs. In fact, Mr. Browning has just offered me a job at this very moment." Jane could tell by the look on the Marshal's face that he was embarrassed by his choice of words, and Jane felt bad. Maybe she had been a little too harsh, but it had been a long couple of days and Jane was tired. She didn't want her journey to Texas to have been in vain and felt like she needed to defend her intentions to stay. "I am glad you came by," Jane continued. "I wanted to thank you for your help yesterday and for telling me the truth about Day, Mr. Harper." "It's no trouble at all, Miss Mellor," said the Marshal. "I was only doing my job." "Well, you saved me a great deal of trouble and embarrassment, nonetheless." Had Jane not known better, she could have sworn she saw the slightest hint of a blush on the Marshal's cheeks. "In that case, I guess I should welcome you to your new home," he managed after a while. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." With that, the Marshal lifted his hat slightly and left the mercantile. Chapter 11. Just like that, Savior Springs became Jane's new home. It was amazing how quickly something that used to be unfamiliar and frightening became safe and ordinary. Jane decided to stay at the inn until she had enough money saved to afford her own place to rent. Every morning she woke up and had breakfast with Mrs. Keeling, who had become almost like a mother to her. Following breakfast, she walked across the road to the mercantile, where she spent the day. Jane had been a little nervous at first about what the good people of Savior Springs might think of this newcomer, but she soon found that they were all friendly and, more than anything, just curious about her. Jane happily told them about her old life in New York, and that she had come to Savior Springs to make a new life for herself and to build happy memories rather than sad ones. Working in the shop was fairly easy, and Jane found joy in helping Mr. Browning to run the mercantile. For the most part, business was good, and Jane made a little money that she was able to save towards renting a place of her own. Truthfully, even if she was not paid, she'd happily help out anyway because Mr. Browning was such a sweet man. He treated her with kindness and fairness. Jane had not forgotten to write to both Sarah and Amelia, whom she had met on the train. At first, Sarah had tried to persuade her to come back to New York after finding out that Daniel was a fraud, but Jane assured her that she was happy and content staying in Savior Springs. So it was that winter turned into spring, and before Jane knew it, she had become very fond of her new life. One Monday morning, as she stood behind the counter at the mercantile, sorting out receipts and making sure the list of orders was as it should be, she noticed Mr. Browning looking a bit pensive. "Is everything all right, Mr. Browning?" Jane asked, and stopped what she was doing. Despite his age, the older man was in relatively good health, but over the past couple of months, Jane had noticed that he needed to take it a little easier. She didn't mind doing more of the heavy work because she enjoyed it. There was something about the look on Mr. Browning's face, however, that felt strange, and Jane couldn't quite put her finger on exactly what that was. "Oh yes, I was just a bit lost in my own thoughts," Mr. Browning explained. While that was certainly true, Jane could tell there was something else on his mind as well, and she wondered what it was. "It's just that it seems like something is bothering you, if you don't mind me saying so," Jane said as she leaned forward with her arms on the counter. "Nothing escapes you, does it?" Browning chuckled. "You are right, though. I have been thinking, but it is not really my place to comment on it." Normally, Mr. Browning was a man with a good sense of humor, and whenever Jane was at work, there was a lot of laughter between them. That's not to say that he wasn't very serious about his business, and it had become clear to Jane since she started work that the people of Savior Springs held him in the highest regard. "You have been very good to me since I moved here, Mr. Browning," said Jane. "You are always welcome to speak freely about your opinions, no matter what they might be." He placed a couple of items on a shelf and then turned so that he was facing Jane. "It's just that I can't help but notice that Harry has been coming by the store more frequently since you started working here," Mr. Browning began. "I know that the trouble with Mr. Harper was a bit of a setback for you, but you seem to be happy here in town, and well, Harry has never been wed. You two have a lot in common and seem to like each other's company. Perhaps he might be a good match for you?" Jane fell silent as she considered the man's words, mostly because she simply did not know what to say. Mr. Browning wasn't wrong in that the Marshal had been coming by the shop very frequently, but there was nothing strange about that. After all, it was his job to make sure that the town and its businesses were safe. Harry had never behaved in such a manner that might suggest he would be interested in marrying Jane. Instead of responding with words, Jane burst out laughing, which surprised both her and the shopkeeper. Harry was kind, and Jane always enjoyed talking with him when he visited the store, but he was only doing his job as a marshal. Jane was certain that Harry had similar conversations with the other shopkeepers and townsfolk. The idea that he would stop by the mercantile simply to speak with her was ridiculous. "I apologize for my reaction, Mr. Browning." Jane apologized as she caught her breath. "It's just that I do not believe that the Marshal sees me in that way at all." "Perhaps not, and it is, of course, your choice whether to pursue it or not, but I was simply making observations. Now then, would you mind quickly running across the road to the tailor's and picking up the order from the other day?" There's not much business today, so I think we can close up the store early and maybe have ourselves a cup of tea, don't you think? Certainly. Even though Jane carried about her day as normal, the words spoken by Mr. Browning still whirled around in the back of her mind, and she could not help but think that the old man might have a point. Immedincus palatino scrormal. I think Mr. Browning is right. We can all see it, Jane. It was later that afternoon, and the sun was about to begin its journey below the horizon, turning the color of the sky shift to various shades of pink and orange. Jane was having tea with three women with whom she had formed a close friendship over the past couple of months. They all sat on the porch of Jane's house, which she was renting with the money earned from her work at the mercantile. It wasn't a big house by any means. It had a small cooking area, a bed in the corner, a desk, and most importantly, a porch. Jane always spent her evenings rocking in a chair on the porch, just watching the world go by under the evening sun. She enjoyed listening to the sound of crickets chirping in the grass around her and taking in all the scents and smells that were new to her. During her first few weeks in Savior Springs, Jane worried that perhaps the women in town would find her strange and therefore not want to make her acquaintance or be her friend. Those concerns were soon proven wrong, and Jane found that she had much more of a social life than she had in New York. Sure, she missed those Wednesday afternoon teas at Sarah's house, but the only person she'd really been friends with was Sarah. Jane knew for a fact that the other women thought her rather an oddball. Not that she necessarily cared about other people's opinions of her, but she was grateful that Savior Springs was different. Everyone? Jane asked. You mean people are talking about it? Of course people are talking about it, said Annie, a young woman, originally all the way from Illinois. It's the only exciting thing currently happening in town. Jane didn't like being the center of attention, and she felt a bit foolish for not even noticing the things people were saying. Ever since Mr. Browning mentioned that she and Harry would be a good match, Jane had found it difficult to behave normally around the Marshal whenever he came into the store. Truthfully, Jane would be lying if she said she had not thought about Harry. He was a kind, strong, and handsome man with a gentle heart. She enjoyed their conversations, and sometimes it felt as though time stopped when they were in each other's presence. You do like him a little, don't you? Teased Charlotte, a woman with long blonde hair that she always wore in a braid, who spoke with a heavy Texan accent. I don't know. Jane felt her cheeks flush red with embarrassment. He is rather handsome and kind, but I do not believe he even thinks of me in such a way. Well, in that case, you surely need a pair of spectacles, Annie pointed out. It is clear to us that he has taken an interest in you. Being the Marshal's wife would not be so bad. No, Jane thought, it would not. Even if Jane felt something for the Marshal, she did not know what to do about it. The whole purpose of her moving out west had been to find a suitable man to marry, but over the past few months, Jane had been busy making herself at home in Savior Springs, and quite frankly had forgotten about that. Jane was certain that she still wanted to marry, and perhaps even have children in the near future. She just hadn't considered that the Marshal might be that man, and now she couldn't stop thinking about it. You are blushing like a cherry blossom tree, Jane, Charlotte chuckled. There is no denying it. Jane buried her face in her hands as the three friends laughed. What should I do? Jane asked. I cannot very well approach him about it. It would be rude. Perhaps one might suggest, Charlotte replied, that you simply strike up a conversation with him that is not just about the store. Jane exhaled a heavy sigh, realizing that her friends were right. She was a little scared, though, and certainly did not want to be too forward in case it turned out that she had gotten it all wrong. Chapter 12. Chapter 12. A couple of days later, Jane went to work and found that Mr. Browning was feeling unwell. At first, he tried to tell Jane that he would be perfectly capable of running the store, but she could see that he was feeling ill, and so she insisted that he spend the day at rest. By now, Jane was comfortable running the store and knew most of the customers by name, so she felt confident she would be able to do a good job even without Mr. Gwell. Browning. Even though Mr. Browning was fit and healthy, it was still clear that age was catching up with him. There were times when Jane could tell he was in pain after having reached for items from a shelf or when sitting down too quickly. However, Jane also understood that Mr. Browning was a man with a lot of pride, and so she knew much better than to question his choices. The old man respected her and was kind to her, and therefore Jane was kind to him and respected him. Mostly, running the store meant making sure the shelves were stocked with the right items, handling the register, and taking payments from customers. Over the past few months, Jane had learned that the mercantile was also where people stopped for a chat, and quite often that involved the local gossip. For a town as small as Savior Springs, there was rather a lot of gossip going around the town. Within less than 2 days of living there, almost everyone Jane had spoken to knew her name, and that she had moved from New York with the hopes of marrying Daniel Harper. Jane had been terrified that the townsfolk would think her just another foolish woman who had fallen for Harper's plot. Admittedly, Jane knew that she hadn't been the first woman to fall for Daniel's scheme, but she had been so enchanted by the idea of finding her happily ever after in the matrimonial times. Every so often, Jane also thought about the little girl she had met in Central Park, Clara, and wondered how she was getting along. A part of her wished that she knew Clara's surname so that she might be able to write her a letter thanking her, but perhaps that was a silly notion. The gossip in Savior Springs was quite different from the gossip in New York, and even though Jane did not partake in it herself, she did listen. It was a good way to get to know the townsfolk, and as a result of lending them an ear, Jane was often invited over for tea or for lunch, which she, of course, gratefully accepted. That day, the shop was particularly quiet, and so Jane was free to serve Mr. Browning her soup in between serving customers. Thankfully, the shopkeeper seemed to simply have a case of the common cold, and Jane guessed that he would be feeling much better in the next day or so. Jane recalled a time when she'd had to look after George when he was unwell and feverish. She remembered being frightened when the fever spiked, knowing how dangerous it could be. Thankfully, George recovered quickly, and Jane hoped that Mr. Browning would do so as well. "You are too kind to me, Jane," said Mr. Browning as he sat up in bed. "Harry would be lucky to have you as his wife, you know." "I am only doing what any good soul would do," Jane told him. "It's really no trouble at all. Rest up now. I will be up a little later." After making sure Mr. Browning was comfortably tucked beneath warm blankets with a soup bowl in his hands, Jane went back downstairs to keep an eye on the shop. Mr. Browning lived in the living quarters upstairs, and so it wasn't a long way for Jane to go to check on him. It was usually fine to leave the store unattended for a few moments. Jane set her foot on the last step into the store and heard a noise that caught her off guard. At first, she thought that a customer was browsing around the store while waiting for someone to serve them. However, when Jane listened to the conversation, she realized that the intention was far more sinister. Carefully, she walked towards the back door of the store and saw 2 men standing by the counter. One of them was tall and blonde, while the other was shorter and stouter with brownish hair. To Jane's horror, she saw that the shorter of the two had his hands in the tin box where all the money was kept. "What do you think you are doing?" The 2 men stopped what they were doing and caused quite the ruckus with items falling off the counter. Instead of staying in the store where it was safe, Jane hurriedly followed them outside. She didn't have a plan and, in fact, did not know what to do. She just did not want them to get away with stealing Mr. Browning's money. Jane walked along the side of the wooden building, and as she was about to round the corner, the tall, blonde man appeared. Before Jane had a chance to say or do anything, the outlaw grabbed her by the waist, and she could feel his awful sharp nails dig into the fabric of her clothes. "Let me go," Jane screamed. "Please." "I don't think so, girl," the man said with a sneer. "You're coming with us." Jane's heart was beating so fast that she thought it might very well leap out of her chest. She wanted to fight the man, but his grip on her was too tight as he flung her onto the horse. Jane continued to scream and struggle, and just as she thought they were going to get away with their crime and with her, a gunshot rang out loudly. "Well, what do we have here?" came Harry's voice. "I haven't seen you boys around these parts before. Why don't you mind your own business and you won't have to see us around these parts ever again?" said the short man. Jane caught Harry's eye, and even though she was glad that he was there, she was still very frightened by the whole situation. It was not how she had imagined this day to go. "I'm afraid I can't do that, fellas," Harry said. "You see, I am the Marshal of this town, and as such, it is my job to protect its establishment and its people. Now, I'm going to give you a choice." "Oh, yeah?" said the taller of the two outlaws. "What kind of choice would that be?" "Oh, it's very simple. Put this young lady down and leave town forever, or there will be trouble. You mark my words." At first, Jane thought that the outlaws would laugh off Harry's threat and ride away with her anyway. Instead, they did just the opposite and released Jane before galloping out of Savior Springs. Jane felt herself shaking, still filled with fear after the awful event. She ran into Harry's arms, much to his surprise. "Thank goodness you were here," Jane gushed. "I was so scared. Thank you for saving me from those awful men." Before Jane could speak her mind further, a horrible thought came to her. Harry might have saved her life, but those men had made off with Mr. Browning's money. When Jane realized that, she burst out crying. She would never be able to forgive herself for being so reckless, simply because she had forgotten to make sure a door was locked. "What is it, Jane?" Harry asked worriedly. "Did they hurt you?" "No," Jane sniffed. "It's just, they got away with Mr. Browning's money. There's not much left at all." "How much is left?" Jane reached down and picked up the tin box from the ground. Inside, a few coins covered the bottom of the tin, making Jane feel even worse. "Not more than $3, Jane said. "There was at least 10 in there." She showed Harry the tin, and when she looked up at him, she saw his eyes darken, and a serious expression came into his eyes. "You go back to the store, and I'll pursue those men to get the money back," Harry assured her as he mounted his horse and rode away. Break Dinkus Palatino -- screen. Jane knew that there was no way Harry would be able to catch up with the men. They were too far gone and probably knew of many secret places in which to hide. In her mind, Jane had already gone through many scenarios of what to tell Mr. Browning. She could use some of her saved wages to make sure the lost money was accounted for, as it was her fault it had been stolen in the first place. Therefore, it surprised Jane when Harry walked into the store no more than a half-hour later, just as he had said, bearing the sum of $7.24 in change. Jane knew that he hadn't caught up with the outlaws, but truthfully, she did not care. The money was accounted for, and she would not have to tell the shopkeeper that it had been stolen at all. "Thank you, Harry," Jane thanked him as she placed the money tin back on the counter. A heavy weight was lifted off her chest as she breathed out all the previous anxiety and fear. "I know you didn't follow the men, and I am so grateful for your generosity and your help." "There's no need to thank me, Jane," Harry assured her. "I am only doing my job after all." "Well, Savior Springs is lucky to have a marshal such as yourself." Harry chuckled, and Jane could swear she saw the slightest hint of a blush on his cheeks. She began tidying the counter and clearing up the mess left by the outlaws. She then became aware that Harry was still there. "Jane, there is something I would like to ask you." The marshal approached her with his hands in his pockets, like a schoolboy talking to a girl he took a liking to. "Might you be free on Sunday after church? I know a place by the creek and thought that perhaps we could have a picnic." Jane almost dropped the broom she'd been holding and felt herself blush, undoubtedly more noticeably than Harry. She knew very well that the other women in town thought she and Harry were a good match. And of course, Mr. Browning would not stop talking about it. Sure, Jane very much enjoyed Harry's company whenever he visited the store. He was handsome, funny, and smart. He always listened to what she had to say, and he never thought her opinions or ways of thinking were silly. Truthfully, Jane was a little scared. When she thought she would marry Daniel, she thought it would be easy. After learning about the real Daniel, Jane was worried she might be misled again. She didn't truly think Harry was dishonest about his intention, especially after his show of character after the theft, but the thoughts were still in Jane's head. "I would love to have a picnic with you, Harry," Jane answered finally, and Harry seemed almost relieved that her response was positive. "Wonderful. I look forward to seeing you then. Goodbye for now, Jane." She nodded her head and smiled as he left the store. Chapter 13. After Harry left the mercantile, Jane told Mr. Browning what had transpired earlier. At first, the old man was worried about Jane and wondered if she had been hurt. She explained that thanks to Harry's bravery, all the money was accounted for. Mr. Browning expressed his guilt over leaving Jane alone to deal with such a terrible ordeal, but Jane assured him that everything was fine. Truthfully, she was much happier that Mr. Browning had been upstairs and safe and sound instead of facing the two outlaws. The truth was, Jane was more than aware of how badly things could have turned out had the outlaws managed to ride off with her. She truly owed Harry an incredible debt that she would never be able to repay. Then again, Jane also had a feeling that Harry Unsworth was a man who wouldn't see it as any kind of favor owed by her because he was merely doing his job as a marshal. Jane counted the days until Sunday. She could hardly sleep for excitement at the idea of picnicking with Harry. She always dressed properly and smartly for church on Sunday, but this Sunday she wanted to look her very best. So Jane decided to wear her favorite sky blue dress that she hadn't worn since leaving New York. Other than the store, the church was a gathering place for the townsfolk on Sundays. Jane usually sat in one of the center pews next to either Mr. Browning or her lady friends. It was a struggle to pay attention to the service, even though she was usually keen to hear the pastor preach. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, the service was over, and Jane almost leaped out of her seat to meet Harry outside the church. Some of her friends giggled when they walked past Jane, and she knew she would have to tell them all about the picnic afterwards. It seemed as though Harry had also decided to wear his finest clothes, a red waistcoat over a white shirt paired with black pants. When he saw Jane, he walked up to her, carrying a woven picnic basket in one hand and his hat in the other. "Good morning," Jane said formally. "Hello, you are looking lovely today," Harry replied in an effort to ease the obvious tension. "Are you ready to go?" She reddened slightly at his kind words. "Yes, very much so." Harry offered his arm, which Jane hooked into hers, and they made their way on foot in the direction of the creek. Image, break dinkus palatino screen. Even though Jane had been living in Savior Springs for a few months now, she had never been to the creek. She had simply been too busy getting used to her new life and working at the mercantile. Sitting at the creek with the grass caressing her hands, she felt at peace. Above them, a few clouds floated by, and Jane heard birdsong all around them. It was a fairly simple picnic. Harry had brought lemonade, bread with cheese, and chocolate. Despite the lack of diversity in the picnic basket, Jane was happy. "That one looks like a sheep, don't you think?" Jane said as she pointed up at a particular cloud above them. "You're right," Harry agreed. "What about that one? Looks a bit like a rabbit, I think." "I love rabbits. When I was a little girl, there was a place in Central Park where you could sometimes see them just peacefully going about their day without so much as a care in the world." "Do you miss it? New York, I mean." Jane thought for a while. She didn't necessarily miss New York as a city, but she missed some of the people she had shared her life with in the city. For instance, she missed Sarah and their long walks around the park. She also missed her daily routine and enjoying a cup of tea at the small cafe around the corner from her tenement. She had so many memories of New York that were tied to specific people, like George and Sarah and even her parents. Jane had never lived anywhere she could be who she wanted to be and make entirely new memories. That was a gift that Savior Springs had given her, even though making her way had at times been rather difficult. Had it not been for the kindness of the townsfolk, Jane would still be struggling and might even have made the decision to give up entirely. "There are some things I miss, like my best friend Sarah," Jane admitted. "However, Savior Springs has all I could possibly want, and I am happy here. It's peaceful, safe, and close to nature in a way that New York wasn't." "Do you think you might go back someday?" Harry asked with a slight hint of concern in his voice. No, this is my home now. I am very happy to hear that. So am I. Jane blushed, which she always seemed to do in Harry's presence, but she agreed with him. In fact, she was more than happy that she had made the decision to stay in Savior Springs, despite the awful business with Daniel. Harry was unlike any man she had ever met before. He was different from George both in appearance and behavior, but not at all in a bad way. Imig Dinkus Palatino screen. Jane and Harry spent the better part of the afternoon at the small creek. They talked about everything and nothing. She learned that Harry was the oldest of 3 children. Both of his sisters were married and lived in other areas of Texas. Despite living in the same general part of the country, there was not much time for them to visit each other. Harry had explained that the last time he'd seen them both was at the christening of his youngest niece some months before. They did keep in touch through letters, which excited Jane because she adored writing letters. Even during the moments of silence, Jane was still comfortable in Harry's company. At first, she'd been a little worried that their conversations might prove somewhat dull since they hadn't spent time together outside of his brief visits to the mercantile. So, when will you see him again? Charlotte asked a couple of days later when the ladies were having tea on Jane's porch. This Sunday, after church, Jane replied as she reached for the cup of tea in front of her. He said he has a special place he wants to show me, and when I asked where it was, he said I would simply have to wait to see. Both Annie and Charlotte oohed and ahed and then giggled. Jane felt as though she was a schoolgirl again, but she had forgotten how much she had missed the feeling of anticipation before seeing someone. She had no idea where Harry was going to take her on Sunday, and a part of her wanted to know so that she could prepare. But that would take away the mystery of it all. You know, Jane, Annie began, for as long as I have known Harry Unsworth, I have never known him to be quite so taken with a woman as he is with you. Don't be ridiculous, Jane blurted while shaking her head. I am sure there have been countless other women who have taken to him. Oh, certainly, they have taken to him, Annie confirmed. But he has had no interest in anyone. In all honesty, Jane, some of us were starting to lose hope of him ever finding the woman of his dreams, until you came along. I am not the woman of his dreams. Then why has he asked to see you again? Charlotte teased. Do not tell us that even now, after he has clearly shown an interest in you by asking you to a picnic, you do not believe his intentions. Jane did not have an answer to Charlotte's question. In fact, she had been pondering the notion herself. Was it so strange for someone like Harry to take a shine to someone like Jane? During the picnic, it was clear that they shared many interests and Harry made her feel at ease. Perhaps, Jane thought, she was just being needlessly cautious about what could, in all possibility, turn out to be wonderful. Are you at least looking forward to seeing him again? Annie asked, changing the subject ever so slightly. I am, Jane confessed. I just wish he would tell me where he is taking me. What if I dress entirely inappropriately for the occasion and then make a fool of myself? The 3 friends laughed again for a good while and then moved the conversation on before Charlotte and Annie left for their homes. Jane retired inside and sat down at the small desk in the corner of her bedroom. She opened the drawer to remove her writing paper and dipped the tip of the quill in the ink she had purchased just a couple of days before. She had been writing to Sarah regularly, and it was her time to reply to the latest letter, which had taken Jane a little longer to get around to because life had been rather busy and eventful lately. My dear Sarah, spring in Texas is nothing like spring in New York. For one thing, the weather is quite warm here all year round, whereas in New York, snow might still linger at times until the warmth of the sun decides it's time for a change in season. Tell me, is that sweet old woman still selling roasted almonds at the entrance to Central Park? There are some things I miss about living in a larger city, and those almonds are one such thing. However, Texas has plenty to offer that you would not be able to do or find in New York. Everything here is so close to nature. Horses and cattle roam the wide-open plains, and you can hear crickets chirping loudly in the tall grass at night. It's my favorite pastime in the evening when I get home from work. I love sitting in my rocking chair with a cup of tea, just closing my eyes while I listen to the music of nature around me. I am at peace here. Oh, you asked me about Harry, and there have indeed been some developments. Two thieves stole the takings from the store just last week and almost absconded with me on horseback. Harry saved me and scared those awful men out of town. I know you will be worrying, but I am fine. It will make for an exciting tale one day, but something good also came of it. Harry asked me to join him for a picnic after church on Sunday, and I said yes. He brought a picnic basket filled with bread, cheese, lemonade, and even chocolate. We sat in a lovely spot next to the small creek that supplies the town with water, and it was lovely. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too warm with a slight breeze. I must admit, I was a little worried at first because I thought we might not have much to talk about outside of his visits to the store. But how wrong I was. We talked for hours about everything and nothing at all. He is so kind, thoughtful, and funny. He asked me about New York and if I missed living there. I told him that I do not really miss the city, but I miss the people I left behind, such as you. Oh, I do hope you might be able to visit one day. I truly believe you would love it out here. Where was I? Oh yes, the picnic. He walked me home and we agreed that we would see each other again. So this coming Sunday after church he is taking me to a secret venue. I haven't the faintest idea where, but I am excited nonetheless. Oh Sarah, I am so glad to have met Harry. After the embarrassing ordeal with Daniel, I thought that I was not meant to meet someone new. Yet I have. How is life in New York? Have I missed anything exciting? Your very dear friend, Jane. Chapter 14. Time was, Jane thought, quite peculiar. Sometimes it seemed to pass so slowly, but sometimes time literally just flew by. Just as she had before the picnic, Jane counted the days until Sunday when she could see Harry again. Even though she kept herself busy at the store and with the upkeep that came with living in a house, her mind still drifted to Harry. Mr. Rowe. Browning had noticed Jane's good mood during work and did not miss a moment to tease her about it, which Jane, of course, did not mind. Jane was very glad that Mr. Browning was back on his feet after his recent illness. Chicken soup, Jane knew, truly worked wonders. Finally, Sunday came around, and Jane was out of bed before the rooster because she was so excited. She enjoyed her breakfast while browsing through her wardrobe, deciding what to wear. She could not wear the blue dress again, even though it was one of her favorites. She could not be sure of a suitable dress since Harry had not told her where they were going. After much deliberation, Jane finally settled on a light green dress that she had bought in New York a few years before, but seldom found an opportunity to wear. It was proper enough to wear for church and hopefully suitable for whatever Harry had planned for them that afternoon. Jane sat down in her chair and brushed the tangles out of her hair before braiding it neatly. Beside the mirror was a photograph of her mother. Even though Jane had been quite young when her mother passed away, she still thought about her every day. She often wondered what her mother would think about her new life. Would she endorse her move to Texas, leaving all she knew in her wake, or would she be upset? In her heart, Jane knew that her mother would be proud of her. She might have few memories of her, but the memories Jane did have revolved around learning to be a strong woman who could make the right choices for herself to ensure her own happiness. Jane lived by those words even to this day. Sure, she might have made mistakes along the way, but she had always learned from them, and they had indeed made her a stronger person. "This will do, Jane," she said out loud and put the brush down beside her mother's photograph. Image, Break Dinkus Palatino screen. Church was as busy as always, but this particular week, Jane felt that the sermon spoke directly to her. The pastor preached about the importance of blind faith and the part it played in people's lives. Jane couldn't help but wonder if a divine force from above wanted her to know that everything would be all right and that there was no need for her to worry. As the pastor continued with his sermon, Jane glanced around the church. The usual familiar faces were there, and she even noticed the barkeep of the saloon trying his best not to fall asleep. His wife helped by nudging him in the side, and Jane tried not to laugh. There was no sign of Harry, though. He usually sat across the aisle at the front with his deputy, but he was missing. "Jane," Charlotte whispered as she'd noticed Jane's concerned look. "What's wrong?" "Harry's not here." Jane replied. Reason told her that there was no need to immediately start worrying. There could be many reasons for Harry not being at church that morning. Perhaps he had been held up at work, or he might have overslept, even though the latter was unlikely. There was still a worrying thought lingering in the back of Jane's mind, a voice that told her he decided to not show up because he did not wish to see her. Maybe he had realized that he could do much better than Jane and had simply decided not to tell her. No, Jane thought. Those anxious concerns did not fit with the Harry she had come to know over these past few months. She was still very worried about him and couldn't help but wonder if something had happened to be concerned about. It was difficult to focus on the last half hour of the sermon. Jane's thoughts continuously drifted to awful scenarios in her head about what might have happened to Harry. As soon as the service was over, Jane hurried out of the church before she could be deterred by either Charlotte or anyone else. By now, everyone knew that she had plans with Harry after church, and she did not want to deal with the embarrassment of him not showing up. While most of the townsfolk stayed behind to talk and catch up on local gossip, Jane quickly made her way into town. Apart from a couple of people, the streets of Savior Springs were pretty much empty, which wasn't difficult to achieve, given it was a small town. As Jane walked towards the Marshal's office, she stopped when she saw 3 men on horseback outside. She did not recognize them as townspeople, and strangers did not often visit Savior Springs unless they knew someone in town. Something about their appearance scared Jane, and she immediately recalled the tumultuous affair with the outlaws at the Mercantile. For a moment, it seemed as though time was frozen. Jane stood looking at the 3 men, not knowing what to do. It was clear that they had bad intentions, and there was no way she would be able to protect herself against 3 of them. She thought they might address her, but they set off on their horses instead, very nearly knocking Jane over in the process. Her heart immediately began to beat faster, and she had a horrible feeling that Harry was in trouble. Ignoring the dust on her dress and the speed of her heartbeat, Jane rushed into the Marshal's office. At first, she thought nobody was there, but as she walked further into the room, she saw a pair of shoes sticking out from behind the table. Fearing the worst, she ran over to find Harry unconscious on the floor. Jane fell to her knees with tears in her eyes, unsure of what to do. "Harry," she cried. "Harry, please wake up." There was no response from Harry, and Jane began to sob as she bent over him on the floor. She gently shook him. When that didn't work, the sobs became a flood of tears, and she started bashing him on the chest with her fist. "Don't you leave me like this." Slowly, Harry began to open his eyes, and he moaned softly. Jane stopped hitting him and instead held him close. "Jane?" he managed to say. "Yes, it's me. I'm here. Stay still." He lay still as she ordered for a few seconds, and then the world regained focus. He spoke a little more clearly. "What happened?" "The last thing I remember was being hit on the head." "There were 3 men outside," Jane explained. "They were on horseback and almost knocked me over when they left." "Who were they?" Carefully, Harry sat up and leaned against the wall. Jane noticed that he had a small laceration on his forehead that she would have to treat later. "They were a gang of outlaws who have been causing trouble around these parts for quite some time now," Harry explained. "A while back, I locked one of their members up, and so they paid me a visit today to exact their revenge. Turns out they are not very good at their jobs." Jane chuckled tentatively, feeling such a wave of relief that Harry was not seriously hurt. He would undoubtedly be a little sore for a while, but nothing that Jane couldn't take care of. "I am so glad that you are not hurt," Jane said. "I was worried when you weren't at church." "I did not mean to make you worry," Harry apologized. "I am sorry for causing you to worry and for putting you in harm's way. I am not a very good marshal." No, do not apologize. I am fine and you are alive. That is all that matters to me." They sat in silence for a while, and Jane blushed a little when she realized that Harry had put his hand on hers. "Jane," "There is something I would like to ask you," Harry said after a while. "Yes? What is it?" "I think I might want to kiss you, if you might be agreeable to that." "Yes, I think I would like that very much." Butterflies flitted in Jane's stomach as Harry very carefully and gently put his lips to hers. Jane knew at that moment that she never wanted to kiss anyone else in her life. Epilogue. Jane Mellor used to believe that she was cursed with bad luck. First, her mother died when she was young, and her father treated her horribly. Then the man she thought was the love of her life died in a tragic accident. Surely, Jane believed that meant that she was simply not meant to find her happily ever after. For a while, she had come to peace with that thought. Life, it seemed, had other plans for Jane. Had someone told her when she was a little girl that she would find a home in a small town in Texas named Savior Springs, she would never have believed it. Throughout her life, Jane thought that New York was where she would live, but she knew now that it simply wasn't true. 6 weeks had passed since Jane found Harry unconscious in the Marshal's office. Only a couple of days later, he asked Jane if she would marry him, and Jane, of course, said yes. "Oh, Jane, you look absolutely beautiful," Sarah gushed. She had traveled to Texas as soon as Jane had written to her. As soon as she met Harry, Sarah knew that he was the right choice for her friend. "Do you think Harry will think so?" Jane asked, as concerned as any bride on her wedding day. "I have no doubt in my mind that he will." Jane was nervous, but filled also with joy and excitement. She stood and turned to face Sarah, who had made it from New York to be her maid of honor. Jane felt incredibly blessed and lucky to have such a true friend. As she looked at herself in the mirror, Jane couldn't believe that the woman in the reflection was the same woman who once thought she would live out her days alone after George's death. She had also once believed that she would never love anyone the way she loved George. But now she had Harry Unsworth. Harry was everything Jane could ever want and more. After the wedding, they had agreed to move into Jane's house as it was big enough for two and perhaps children in the near future. There was a knock on the door, and Mr. Browning walked into the room. The mercantile owner had kindly offered to be the one to give Jane away at the altar, and she couldn't be any happier. "Are you ready, dear?" Mr. Browning asked with a smile on his face, dressed in his finest clothes. "Yes," Jane said. "Yes, I am." The whole town attended the wedding, even those townsfolk to whom Jane had barely spoken. It seemed as though everyone was glad that Harry had finally found a perfect match in Jane, and they were more than excited about the wedding, which was held at the local church. After the wedding, the townsfolk held a party that lasted long into the night. When Jane and Harry shared their first dance as husband and wife to one of Jane's favorite waltzes, she finally knew happiness. It was late into the evening, and while some guests had left for home, a few guests still remained at the party, happily talking and laughing about the events of the day. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Unsworth?" Harry asked softly as they swayed to the sound of the music. "Well, Mr. Unsworth," Jane replied, "I was just thinking how life always finds a way to make things right." Harry replied with a kiss, and as Jane rested her head against his chest and closed her eyes, she knew that she was finally exactly where she belonged.